I think the theory of change is not difficult with Russia. And actually plenty of now exiled Russian thinkers talk about this very openly. It's Russia becoming a normal nation state, giving up its idea of empire, giving up the idea that it has the right to subjugate its neighbors, living in humility and with respect to its neighbors. So look, exactly like Germany after World War II, that was the great attempt there as well. It's a Russia whose political psychology changes from a cycle of humiliation and aggression to one of respect and rights. So we kind of know what it is, you know? And so weirdly, we know where to get to. With a lot of countries, we don't know where they're meant to get to. With Russia, we kind of know. So how do you get there? The job of the propagandist is to reach into that place where your identity, your psychology, and sort of public perceptions and politics meet, and to manipulate that. You know, to work out your anxieties and exploit them so that you vote a certain way, basically. The lies and the post-truth are, well, they're part of our culture at the moment for interesting reasons. But they're also they're a symptom rather than a cause, or they're a tactic. That's what matters. That's what's eternal. That's what propaganda has always been about. And in that sense, propaganda is closest to art. Art also reaches in to your anxieties, to your fears, to your perception of yourself, and works on that.
Dear all, my name is Grzegorz Jankowicz, and I'm the program director of the Konrad Festival. This is a series of interviews called The Nature of the Future, in which I talk to writers, philosophers, sociologists, film or theater directors, in one word, intellectuals, about the phenomena and processes that determine our lives today. Together with them, I also try to imagine how these phenomena and processes will look in the future, how these processes will function in the future. My interviewee today is Peter Pomerantsev. Hello, Peter.
Hi, how are you doing?
Let me briefly introduce you to our audience. Peter Pomerantsev is a British author, film director and producer who emigrated with his parents from the Soviet Union when he was 9 months old. He wrote 2 books, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and This is Not Propaganda, Adventures in the War Against Reality. Both of them were translated into Polish. He writes for numerous journals and lectures at the universities in the UK and in the US. He's an expert on propaganda, and that's what's going to be the focus of our conversation today. About a year ago, in an interview, you said that pandemic marked the end of the post-truth era. Indeed, it might have seemed that in the face of a global threat, the lies of politicians and the manipulations of various organizations would finally be exposed as the world's societies demanded verified information about coronavirus. However, the next stage of Russian aggression, the next stage of the war in Ukraine, has made us aware that tools of post-truth have been further intensified, and not only in Russia. From today's perspective, how do you assess our chances in the fight against post-truth, Peter?
Hi, thank you very much for such a brilliant question. I mean, I didn't say it was the last victory. I said it was the great battle, the sort of battle we've been gearing towards between post-truth on one hand and a sort of enlightenment, reality-based community on the other. And certainly what we saw in the US was, you know, it was a very tight fight. But I suspect that part of the reason for Biden's victory was Trump's incompetence in the face of COVID. I think that played a role. So maybe even there it played a role tilting things to something more rational. But at the same time, in America, where I live now, and I should add, I'm not a film director anymore. I was a TV producer, but many years ago, I'm now an academic. So I'm at Johns Hopkins University, and where I study propaganda. So in America, we see this playing out further. I mean, there are huge communities of people here who don't admit the last election, who think that the COVID reaction was politicized and biased. and who adopt different versions of history to the rest of the country. So, you know, America is the epicenter of a lot of these things. Russia is not about, in many ways, it's not really about sort of truth or post-truth. Russia's gamble has been a much more a geopolitical one about the future of the world. Sort of, you know, it's trying to tilt the world towards dictatorships. It's not a great power, but it's a tilting power, and it's tried to sort of gamble that its gestures in Syria, now in Ukraine, will push the world away from America and its democratic allies towards a new future where China, Russia, and other dictatorships dominate. So that's what they're going for. Obviously, in that kind of world, and here maybe connects to post-truth, the idea of the law doesn't matter. The idea of norms don't matter. And all that matters is being strong and might is right. And I suppose if we do think about a world of laws and norms and rights, facts play a role in that, because facts are sort of part of that Enlightenment architecture of meaning. While Russia is saying there is no meaning apart from the meaning created by great powers. Putin yesterday, just a couple of days ago, spoke about this very openly. He said there's two types of power: ones that have sovereignty, as in ones who have the right to destroy others, and colonies. There's only two types. You know, the idea there are states with rights or there are people with rights is absurd. And so I suppose in that sense, it's a challenge to an Enlightenment architecture where facts mediate that architecture. I mean, that's how, you know, we have courts and rights and evidence matters and all these things, while what he's saying and what he's always said, or said for a long time, is that all that is a myth. And in that sense, the right of the powerful is to remake reality, reshape reality. That's what he's doing in Ukraine. He's saying, I will reshape the idea of Ukraine. So in that sense, we're way beyond post-truth. I mean, we're into this kind of like, who has the right to shape reality? And yes, evidence is a resistance to that sort of power. So I guess it does relate to the post-truth argument, but we're in a space where it's power is the real question, and post-truth is the consequence.
In the book on propaganda, you wrote that because they had lost the Cold War, Russian spin doctors and media manipulators managed to adapt to the new world quicker than anyone in the West. But did they actually adapt, or did they just give the impression to scare the West and influence it?
I think what we're talking about here is that they felt, because they kind of, the Russian elites, and I don't even mean Putin here, I mean this whole generation of elites, felt that they had seen the true nature of the world. And that was a world where there are no coherent ideologies, there is no coherent idea of the future, and all that is left is sort of a cynical, endless improvisation. And the truth is very relative in this world as well. So that's what they felt, and that was a cynicism that definitely chimed very strongly with sort of the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I suppose with that became a political strategy that was based less on ideology and facts and much more on identity. You know, and building new identities, creating identity as a political model, an idea of us and them, which is something that Russian political spin doctors had to deal with from the mid-1990s. Yeah, there's no idea of Soviet Union anymore. There's no idea of communist or anti-communist. This whole social class had disappeared. So they started to put together this sort of improvised sort of, you know, it's a version of populism, but not quite, I think. And in that sense, they definitely anticipated there what has become de rigueur everywhere, which is a sort of a politics based on creating political identities, new political identities for every election. So in that sense, I think, yeah, they were ahead of the curve. And that often happens. Often the losers grasp reality faster than the winners.
Then do you think that the situation in Russia can change? Can these concrete sarcophagus of manipulation be shattered by Russian society itself?
What do you mean? What do you mean shattered? That it'll only stay inside of Russia, do you mean, or what do you mean?
I mean by that can Russian society reject the power of Putin and change the structure of the society and the structure of communication within the society from within?
That's a very good question. I think change can happen in Russia. I'm one of the few people who think that, though. So I'm a very rare optimist. Okay, let's just think about what do we mean? What is this change first? And then we can think about how it comes about. I think the theory of change is not difficult with Russia. And actually plenty of now exiled Russian thinkers talk about this very openly. It's Russia becoming a normal nation state, giving up its idea of empire, giving up the idea that it has the right to subjugate its neighbors, living in humility and with respect to its neighbors. So look, exactly at Germany after World War II, that was the great attempt there as well. It's a Russia whose political psychology changes from a cycle of humiliation and aggression to one of respect and rights. So we kind of know what it is, you know? And so weirdly, we know where to get to. With a lot of countries, we don't know where they're meant to get to. With Russia, we kind of know. So how do you get there? I think it's both outside and inside factors. Outside, there has to be a really clear message in policy and in diplomacy that when Russia tries to impose these different rules, then they become shunned by the world. Yeah, that then they are rejected by the world, that there are limits, that it cannot impose a world where might is right. That means being very resolute. That means shunning Russia. It doesn't mean attacking it. It means you can't really attack it. You can shun it. Yeah, a bit like South Africa in apartheid. That means a lot of really strong decisions have to be made. It's not just the oil and gas ban, it's the energy independence from Russia, the world's energy independence from Russia in a really pointed way, in a really intentional way, and as quickly as possible. Because as long as we're dependent on it, we can't shun it. It means, I think now, with Russia trying to hold the world hostage with its food exports, I think it means becoming independent from Russian grain, all the things that Russia provides to the world, which it thinks is its way to leverage the world, all that has to be cut off. It's like with an abusive partner, you have to cut them off. It's painful. It can cost some money because you have to move into a new house, but you have to cut them off. You have to be free of them. You have to be in a position where you can say, no, we shun you. And of course, it means military deterrence. So they can't go into Georgia, Moldova, and of course, Ukraine. So that's the first step. You have to signal very clearly to the Russian people, Russian elites, Russian society that what you've done is unacceptable. What you do is unacceptable. This is not how the world works. And you will now be shunned. Yeah, you are rejected. You are isolated. Nobody wants to touch you. You are a pariah. We feel disgust. Disgust is very important. Because Russia, especially Russia, really needs to be feared and loved. In a mixture of love and fear. They're not very good with disgust. And that needs to happen. And then, but then that's all we can really do. Then everything else happens inside. The idea that the outside can change the inside of Russia is just funny. And you've ever lived there. It's a huge country this is not Nicaragua where like some idiot CIA guys can do a coup. I mean, it's a superpower in that sense, at least. And the rest will have to happen inside. But we can create the conditions and be very, very clear that these conditions are forever. So when people like Macron start going, oh, we need to do a deal next week, when the editorial board of the New York Times says this, we should stop arming Ukraine, so force it into a deal with Russia. This is a way to create more violence, more abuse, more economic security in the future. It's trying to do a deal with an abuser. It's like going up to Harvey Weinstein and saying, well, let's be nice to him and let him back into the party with the actresses. It doesn't work that way. It's a deeply, deeply, deeply sick society. And it's a society which is a predator and an abuser. Putin himself describes himself and his own country as a sexual predator. Before the invasion of Ukraine, he very intentionally joked that Ukraine is a rape victim and he will rape her. Yeah, he did a very, very famous dirty Russian joke saying, comparing Ukraine to Sleeping Beauty, who's being raped, said, lean back, sleep, and take everything I will do to you. He casts himself as an abuser, a sexual abuser, a predator, and a rapist. He sees Russia's role as raping people. With rapists and abusers, if you can't put them in prison, you distance yourself and put as much distance as possible. And seriously, everyone who is trying to cut a deal with them are inviting more rape and more abuse. That is what they're doing. Sorry, I don't know if that sounded a bit over dramatic, but that's exactly what they're doing.
No, I think that you got it right, and it's very good to remind people here in the West of the possible consequences of their passive actions towards Russia and Putin. War always triggers a process of consolidation of those who oppose it, which can lead us to the false conclusion that we are again dealing with a struggle between two worlds. The Western one, which is open and fights for the truth, and the Russian one, which destroys the truth. But the problem of truth, the problem with truth, the problem of propaganda also concerns the West, the North, the South, in general, all places where people use any means of communication. How did you react to words of certain intellectuals from the West, especially leftists, expressing the need to negotiate with Putin instead of supporting Ukraine with military equipment?
So firstly, look, I don't have this Manichaean worldview. I mean, my last book, This Is Not Propaganda, talks about how we see this crisis everywhere. And I certainly don't think it's Russia versus the West in some simple way at all. I live in America, where at least 30% of the country is living in an alternative reality. No. This is a global crisis which plays out in different ways. I think Russia and China are quite unique in that you have dictatorships who are weaponizing this. But no, this is a global crisis, and you find it not just in every country, but in every family. So I certainly would not agree that it's Russia versus the West. However, leftists, look, there are different types of leftists. There's always been different types of leftists. This is an old thing. There's the anti-authoritarian left that goes from George Orwell through, I don't know, in England, Paul Mason today, or I don't know, or Slavomir Sirakovsky, anti-authoritarian leftist, whatever. It's like, this is a great tradition and a really important one. And there's always been an authoritarian left, which I think is psychologically very authoritarian. They like authoritarians. They like them. I think sometimes something to explore, which I haven't done properly, but would be interesting to do some sociological research on, is people who put security over freedom. People who say security, we must do a deal with Putin because peace is more important than freedom. To what extent actually is that classic authoritarian psychology? I mean, if we think authoritarian psychology is that people put security above all else. Yeah, not rights, but security. And usually we think about that as the far right, who like guns and, tanks, and they're obviously really into kind of security through weapons. But when a pacifist says, I put security above all else, and that's what they're saying when they put peace above all else, who is that thing that can represent security ultimately? Ultimately, it's the dictator. Yeah, dictators can control the world to the point where there is peace. So I wonder whether there is something actually authoritarian in this kind of really, in this ideology that puts peace above freedom, and peace above rights, and peace above humiliation. So, and peace above dignity. So I wonder if they're actually just have a very authoritarian mentality. I mean, certainly looking at some of the far left who are into this, they have an almost, they like authoritarian guys. They like going there. They like hanging out with them. They like partying with them. They like them. They're drawn to them. And I don't think it's an accident. So that's always existed. And it's always been a fight within the left. And it's just such an old story. It's sort of new story.
Peter, let's talk about those means of communication that make propaganda so powerful in our times. The internet seems to be the first victim here, right?
Well, look, I don't know. My first book was about TV in Russia in the 1990s, so that was pre-internet. So I certainly wouldn't be essentialist about media, but it can exacerbate trends. It can change the nature of, it always does. New media changes the idea of the self, privacy, the public sphere. It's very interesting. I'm doing a Second World War book now. When radio appeared, people were shocked by how radio was in people's living rooms. They were like, this is the end of the private self. All these essays going, this is the end of the contiguous bourgeois Enlightenment individual, because now we have the radio inside people's homes. The idea of the private space has gone. The public is now in the private. People were thinking about Nuremberg rallies, especially thinking about Hitler. This is, for the pro-Nazi ideologues, this was a sign that people were now no longer broken into individuals, but we're all part of the Volkskommune through the radio. So, and that's kind of true, but it's also utter bullshit. It does change everything, and yet a lot stays the same. And we still read about, I don't know, Shakespeare's England, which is, just in text and performance, and we can still relate to it. So yes, everything changes with a new media. I think that what is very true is that a new media changes political community and the idea of political community, and there's a lot of rupture that happens. I think that is true. So I think it affects psychology and the sense of the self, but maybe more importantly, it does tend to change how we arrange ourselves in the community. We do arrange ourselves around media. The TV was one, 3 TV channels, 3 national TV channels created one sense of community. Novels and newspapers, a slightly different one. And the internet, of course, is now creating a slightly different one. And the nation state will transform. It already is transforming very, very strongly. That is true. The internet will, I think, change community and political community.
Well, the internet, the media certainly provide an opportunity to spread various manipulations to an unprecedented degree. But this is not the only cause of the phenomenon described as post-truth. What are the other deeper sources of today's crisis? What social changes are responsible for it?
Completely, yes. And this is why it's worth talking about my first book, because my first book was about post-truth. It was called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And it was about how the Kremlin relativizes truth and says that truth doesn't really exist, and how that's used as a strategy of power. And that was before the internet. So clearly something was going on before. And I suppose, look, we can look at different factors. I think a very important one is sort of, cultural, political, ideological. And there we have to ask the question of when do facts matter in political and social language? And the answer I'm kind of playing with is that they matter when there's an idea of the future. Facts matter to politicians, to the institutions around politics, newspapers, think tanks, when you're trying to prove something. We have this policy. This is the evidence that we're achieving it. Yeah, this is where evidence matters in political discourse, because generally facts are very unpleasant. They tell you you're going to die. They tell you that you're not doing well in life. I mean, most of the time we run away from facts. So it's actually bizarre that politicians ever used facts. But there was definitely a period when, you had these, especially these technocratic politicians, and before these very Enlightenment-driven politicians. What do I mean by that? Both communism and democratic capitalism are big Enlightenment ideologies. Both of them pretend or claim to deliver a rational version of the future and the better life and utopia. Yeah. So obviously communism very aggressively says it's scientific Marxism, but also Anglo-Saxon, not even European democratic capitalism is rooted in the ideas of the Enlightenment and an idea of the future that we're getting to without it. It's implicit in everything, really. So while there was, especially in the Cold War, while there were two sides claiming to deliver a rational future, they needed to prove they were getting there. So even when the Soviet economy was melting, the Soviets would have these ridiculous think tanks that would prove through some sort of mathematical formula that actually things are going to plan. And it was ridiculous. I mean, there's actually a very good documentary about these special institutes created to prove the economy is doing well when it's going to shit. But it's very important to have evidence. Now, they lied all the time. They faked things. All that was true, but there was still an idea that there is evidence, and that's something valued as an idea. Same with democratic capitalism. And then after the Cold War, you have this period when there's one glorious future of globalization, which is data-driven, based on IMF and World Bank statistics, and we're getting there with the front cover of The Economist as it's sort of like as its little red book. So again, very, very, we are heading towards a future of economic globalization. Here are the institutions that will provide the evidence we're getting there. And then something happens. Then all ideas of the future disappear. and not for everyone, but for many people. So 2008 is a turning point, huge turning point. I think we still haven't worked out just how big it was. The financial crash and its consequences, and just the slow realization for many people their lives aren't getting better, their children are living worse than they are, that they're losing their way of life, and the future is chaotic, uncertain, frightening. And suddenly there's a big constituency for people who don't want facts. The facts just tell them something unpleasant. And politicians telling them facts are just not nice. They don't want to hear that. And so you get this generation of politicians, whether it's Bolsonaro or Trump or Duterte or Putin's been doing it for a long time, who basically say, fuck reality. Who needs reality? Facts are unpleasant. And part of their power was and is that they reject facts. Now, again, COVID was this big moment when suddenly facts mattered again to a lot of people. So that's why I thought COVID was so important. And in England, for example, it was striking. We'd had this moment of we don't need the facts. Brexit was quite an escapist fantasy, a very, very deep one. And I think it was superficial. I think it talked to very deep things. But in many ways, the language around it was nostalgic and fantasist. And then COVID comes along and the country unites around doctors and the NHS and nurses. And suddenly that becomes the nation. And certainly not kind of like, warped versions of history. So I think in many places, COVID did, by the way, play that role. In Italy, Salvini goes down. In France, Le Pen went quiet. In Germany, the AfD collapses. So I think in many places, COVID did play that role of facts suddenly started to matter. But not for long, maybe.
I will ask you about facts and why they matter and how to stick to them in a moment. But let me put in between a question that seems to be very important. How should we think about freedom of speech today in the context of problems with viral spread of disinformation? Should freedom of speech have any limits? And if so, who should draw those lines?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of confusion about this. Like, we have regulations around freedom of speech already, and I don't see the need for new ones. The internet is not about freedom of speech. It's about how that speech gets amplified, targeted, multiplied, distributed. So the regulations we need around the internet are around that. So people's right to say something, look, we have laws around that. They've been elaborated over centuries. I see no reason to radically rewrite them. So it's about incitement to violence and all these sorts of things. That's already codified. That's already in the law. So I don't think you need anything new. I think this is the sort of misreading of the internet. The internet isn't unique in allowing people to say things. The internet is unique in allowing people to, often in a fake way, multiply these things, target them in a dishonest way, use people's data to manipulate them because they know more about them than they know. So all those things, they can be and should be regulated. But the speech itself, I mean, I think this is just a complete misunderstanding of the information environment. I don't see why we should change anything that came before in terms of regulating speech. Regulating its distribution, yes, that should be thought about.
Let's get back to facts, to the problem of facts and with facts. In an article that appeared in The Atlantic, co-written with Anne Applebaum, you wrote that self-expression no longer leads to emancipation. The more we speak, click, and swipe online, the less powerful we are. And both of you suggested that we should be highly interested in facts. You actually repeated it today. Absolutely right. I agree with it completely. But how do we convince people again now of that? How do we convince the societies and individuals within societies that they should care about facts?
So you have to make it relevant to them. You can't just scream at them. You've got to say, well, look, if we want to achieve this, if you want to achieve this, this is how we get there. So like in media as well, stuff like constructive news, instead of just like, we look for solutions to issues. So take something like migration. So we did a lot of research about how you can write about migration in ways that gets people to engage more constructively rather than just through panic and polarization. And it's all about, here is the background to the problem of migration. Here are possible solutions to it. You sort of drive it that way. And then people start thinking about answers and start thinking about evidence. So I think that's the thing in every, and especially for media, in every situation, think about how do you drive this into a future orientated context where facts can matter again. So it's about fostering those conversations. That's the opposite of what we do usually in media. Our job is to play on identity, say, we're for migrants, they're lovely, or we hate them. And there's lots of research that states the complete obvious that a lot of media is about identity building, not about, you know, solutions that can be found in the public sphere to the great policy issues of our age. So that's a problem. And I suppose here the internet has something to blame, because advertising on the internet is usually on Facebook, and what has been up till now. The emotional logic of Facebook with its likes and shares is very much biased towards identity. You know, you're trying to be part of it in group. You're trying to signal where you stand in a group rather than, you know, what you think or what you respect. And so because the ad market is so linked to Facebook, that encourages editors to do materials which are much more based around identity rather than solutions. So we do have a bit of a malign cycle there. And that's bad. That's bad. I think the role of media has to change. I think the role of media has to be around representing different voices in our world, but also driving the conversation to ways which are more, you know, that bring society together in the search for solutions. And that has to be done with a lot of intentionality. Not all media need to do this. Some media can just remain these kind of clubs for identity if they want to, but we definitely need a lot of new media who do think about it that way.
But perhaps we reject facts not because of the circumstances, social or political circumstances, but because of our inner ability, inner needs. There is a great anecdote about William Blake, who said at the meeting with his poetry group that the earth was flat. Someone objected by reminding him that science has already proven that the earth is round. To which Blake said that he was not arguing with science and would not argue that scientists are wrong. He's just arguing that the belief that the earth is flat better suits man's spiritual needs. Maybe we don't want the truth at all, just something that will suit our needs better.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly, well, it's not our needs that will help us run away from reality, because reality is horrible. What do we mean by needs? So no, it's about creating contexts where facts do matter to people, and when they do start mattering again. So yeah, no, I agree. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, and I think it's up to us to work out when and why should facts matter, to be relevant to people and to be useful. You know, there's lots of contexts where facts do matter.
The head of Cambridge Analytica, Alexander Nix, the head of a company that collected data about our online activities and used this data to influence election results, argued during the hearing in the court that his organization was doing just that, responding to people's needs by targeting them with the information they needed to live happily. In this way, Cambridge Analytica, as you wrote in your book, was taking care, in their opinion, in Nick's opinion, they were taking care of democracy. A very specific way of understanding democracy, don't you think?
Yeah, look, Alexander Nix is not a serious person, so I don't really know what to say, but it's interesting the excuses that he uses. But yeah, look, democratic communication definitely includes within it persuasion, you know, information campaigns, convincing people that you should vote for them. That's a completely legitimate part of democratic public sphere. When it stops being democratic is when the other person can't respond as an equal. And if your data is being used without your knowledge in ways that you don't understand, so you're targeted with content, you don't know who's behind it, you don't know what buttons they're pressing, you don't know what they're telling your neighbor, that is not democratic communication. Democratic communication, and this is how it's different to, I would say, propaganda, is that it, you know, the Soviet idea of propaganda, you know, the Eastern European idea of propaganda that I think everyone in Eastern Europe knows, is that it treats the citizen as an equal. Yeah, and the citizen has rights in that conversation, and it can be a conversation. What Nix is doing is propaganda in the Eastern European sense, which is using any type of tool to force people to do something that they did not know they wanted to do. Yeah, those are fundamentally different relationships. And look, there's plenty of propaganda in democracies, but we have to ensure, especially around elections, that we have as much democratic communication as possible and minimize this sort of propaganda that by its very essence undermines the rights of the other person. Yeah, their legal rights, but also their kind of, I don't know, their rights as democratic citizens, their rights as an individual, their right to reality, actually, their right to a share in reality. So I mean, that's very, very important. And the problem with elections like the ones that Cambridge Analytica were involved in is that because it's so untransparent, because we don't understand who's influencing who with what money and why and how, as societies, we then can't decide, well, what the hell happened there? And people are left with this sense like, that was a weird election. It all has to be in the open. It has to be in the public sphere, completely allowed to have advertising that influences each other, but we have to know who's behind it, who paid for it, why they're doing it. You have to have a space to respond in. I mean, that's what a democratic public sphere is. So no, of course, people like Nix are kind of like, you know, Lilliputian versions of the great Soviet propagandists.
How can we defend ourselves from these disinformation processes that destroy democracy? What should we do when you observe the situation in the States and here in Europe, in Middle Eastern Europe? What regulations should be put in place to bring the situation under control? And isn't it the case that regulators are always behind technology and science?
Yeah, look, it's messy, and democracy is messy, and the public sphere is particularly messy. So that's fine. But yes, at the moment, they're too far behind. I think there's a role for regulation, and that's around making the information environment transparent, giving people the chance to respond. Yeah. Again, I'm not saying it should be sterile. It should be messy and mucky and full of shouts and persuasion. But the citizen has to have a way to respond to that. And at the moment, they don't. At the moment, we live in this bizarre world where we have more information than ever before, but less information about how that information environment is formed. We don't understand, as we talked about, who's behind bits of information. We don't understand how our data is being used. We don't understand why algorithms show us one thing and not another. On Facebook, I have no idea. Why am I seeing this and not this? Just no idea. It's bizarre. Back in the bad old days of newspapers and TV stations, you at least knew who owns the newspaper, what their agenda is, who's behind the television station. As a citizen, you could actually criticize. I can't criticize the internet because I do not understand how it's organizing information. So that regulation needs to change that. But that's only one bit. Regulation is one bit. Then you need, architecture. You need, internet architecture, which is more democratic. So I don't think all our political debate should be on Facebook and Twitter. I mean, they're fine for what they do, which is, I don't know, tats, gifts or something, or promoting Coca-Cola, or promoting the far right, which is probably quite similar in terms of tactics. But they're not very good for as an agora for our debates. So we should be creating new spaces. If the BBC was starting today, it would be thinking about how to design a public social media space, not content. So what is the design of new spaces that is better for democratic debate and engagement, et cetera, et cetera? And there's lots of experimentation happening, by the way. But as it would be non-profit, the question is, how is it funded? So that's very important. So creation of new online spaces. And the third one is content. You do need a new iteration of media, which goes back to the roots of public service media, as in helping to create a public sphere. At the moment, public service media, apart from in Britain, has just become boring stuff, boring worthy stuff. The Scandinavians actually have a good tradition as well, where it's their role to integrate a pluralistic debate. It's the role of public service media is to take the far right, the far left, the centrists, and get them into an environment where the rules are clear enough that they can engage with one another. So that's kind of, that's a job for someone. And you can't just do it on TV. We haven't really worked out how you do it online, frankly. We know how to do it on TV. We don't always do it well, but there's a formula for it. We haven't worked out what that means for online content yet, which is targeted by definition. How do you do targeted content, which targets different groups?
Let's analyze certain examples, at least one example of mechanisms that actually make propaganda powerful, or mechanisms that fight against propaganda. Facebook has something called break glass measures, special tools used in periods of heightened tension. You and Applebaum, you wrote about it in your article from The Atlantic. It was out in place after Election Day in the US. But who decides when to activate that kind of tools? How does it work? Do we know that?
No, we have no idea. And this is the problem, that you basically have so much of public discourse in the hands of non-transparent companies. And so we don't even know whether the stuff they do, whether it has an effect or doesn't have an effect. But we basically have the drivers of public discourse hidden in a black box. And that's just not sustainable. That it'll always cause suspicion, distrust, more distrust. We need to get to a place where people trust their information environment, trust the conversations they have, trust each other. And just the fact that we don't know is already very, very debilitating to democracy.
Let's talk about Taiwan, where Audrey Tang, a free software programmer and digital minister, works. Tang has introduced a number of solutions to protect the public from online manipulation, to protect society from online manipulation. What are these solutions, and how are they perceived by the Taiwanese public and by China?
So they do, Taiwan and Estonia are two countries that are really on the avant-garde of digital innovation, both in terms of creating online democracy, whether that's online identity cards and voting online, all those sorts of things, and protecting from neighbors, Russia and China, who use the digital to undermine them. I think with China, the one Taiwan does do, actually, they have a policy on disinformation. And if they see content coming through that is disinforming and affects the political process, so I think around things like elections, then they have a policy of not taking it down, but sort of like identifying it as such. A lot of countries don't have that. So that's like a policy. And I think they force Facebook to do that, or else they'll sue them. I think that's how they've worked it out. What else have they got? They've got, I can't remember. That was one of the big things they have. I think they have a very strong technology policy that, I don't know, I might get this wrong, but I'm doing, maybe your audience can check themselves, but if I remember it rightly, if a tech company cannot invest into or cannot own bits of the Taiwanese infrastructure, if there is any chance that that company will end up in the hands of enemy states, of Chinese states. And as any Chinese company can one day end up in the hands of the Chinese state, that de facto means no Chinese companies are allowed to invest in critical infrastructure. So they don't have, so I think that's it. I think that's kind of their position. That's the kind of a very maximalist position, which we haven't taken in Europe. But, thus we're having all these rows about, Chinese internet companies owning bits of the Western internet.
You also mentioned these software in your text. You mentioned software called Polis.
But that's yeah, got it. That's not got. Yeah, Polis. Polis is the other side. That's trying to make the internet better. So that's a website. Think of it kind of as an anti Facebook. So on Facebook, you go online and it's built, or Twitter, even better. It's built towards being conflictual. It's built towards conflict. This is different. This is a website that's designed in a way that when you take a polarizing issue, like a policy issue, taxes or something, it'll bring different groups together and find consensus positions. So it finds the statements that are most closest to each other and slowly brings people together to find a consensus policy. So it's like the opposite of our social media. It's a social media designed to find consensus, which can be very useful for politics. And the way they use it is in Taiwan is a consultancy tool, a consultative tool for government or for parliament. So society will debate issues that are very polarizing. Polis will show up the places where they have some sort of agreement. And then parliamentarians can enact those laws. I'm
interested in the role of anonymity in all that we are talking about. Propaganda is possible thanks to the anonymity of internet users, and at the same time, thanks to anonymity, victims of violence, for example, can speak their truth, avoiding reprisals from persecutors such as bloody regimes. Plus, shouldn't we have the right to keep anonymity if we don't want to make ourselves present in this online public sphere? How do you look upon these phenomena?
So yeah, people could definitely be. People have the right to not be themselves online. That's a right. You have a right to wear a mask. That's fine. Also, it's for the safety issue, a security issue for people. I think you just have to know that it's a mask. It's like, I am wearing a mask because I want to, because it's safer, because it's fun. That's fine. But we have to know it's a mask. The problem isn't a person wearing a mask. The problem is one person controlling tens of thousands of fake accounts which pretend to be real. You know, that's deceptive. That should be banned. Sort of this coordinated and authentic behavior. It kind of is already by the platforms themselves. Most of the big ones say they don't like it, they'll get rid of it. So troll farms, you know, that's not the same as anonymity. This is again one of the big confusions. It's coordinated deceptive behavior. So actually most platforms say they don't allow that, but they don't do anything about it. Or do very little. So it's a case of who polices that. But yeah, troll farms should be banned. Troll farms shouldn't exist. They should be illegal. I mean, they should be legal, like legally as well. But you know, there should be laws against them. But at the moment, the platforms have policies against them. They're just not very well policed.
I like the way you justify the importance of literature, art, and pop culture. You argue, for example, that literature addresses the same experiences and traumas as populism, but through language brings them into communication so that we can reflect on them and work through our problems. Thanks to literature, thanks to pop culture, we can overcome our problems. Populism preys on our emotions only. But on the other hand, it is well known that literature, art in general, is an excellent means of propaganda.
So listen, this is why I don't like the post-truth debate, is that we think this is a debate between lies and truth, and it's not. It's propaganda happens in that place. The job of the propagandist is to reach into that place where your identity, your psychology, and sort of public perceptions and politics meet, and to manipulate that. You know, to work out your anxieties and exploit them so that you vote a certain way, basically. The lies and the post-truth are, well, they're part of our culture at the moment for interesting reasons. But they're also they're a symptom rather than a cause, or they're a tactic. That's what matters. That's what's eternal. That's what propaganda has always been about. And in that sense, propaganda is closest to art. Art also reaches in to your anxieties, to your fears, to your perception of yourself, and works on that. Except the idea of the art, and I guess the other bit there is psychotherapy. Those are the three, you know, those are the competing spaces. Again, and isn't psychoanalysis a form of literature? I mean, Freud we think of as a novelist these days, really, rather than as a medic. But it's a form of storytelling about your deepest identity. So art and politics overlap. Art and propaganda are very close. And also they compete with each other. So at its best, art does the opposite. Art reaches into those spaces and sets you free and makes you question, while propaganda is trying to put you under somebody's spell. But they're very, very close. This is why propagandists always employ artists and try to get them to their side. And often the artists get seduced and go there. It's a very incestuous relationship, a very dark relationship. And think about the many artists, let's take the 1920s in the Soviet Union, who go and work for the communists. But it never quite works out. You know, look at Eisenstein. You know, he goes with it and then he starts subverting it, because artists at the end of the day will end up subverting and asking questions and opening identities. And that experiment ends very quickly, and very soon you have Soviet social realism and Stalinist art, which is all about imposing an identity very, very strictly through architecture, through art. These are your limits. This is how you must be. And all the avant-garde geniuses are shot. And it's usually a tragic relationship between art and propaganda, but they're very, very close, very, very close. And I teach a course on propaganda, and something I often ask my students is to have a look at the photographs of Diana Harvest, great American photographer of the Great Depression. very famous photographs of, a woman with 2 children, during the Great Depression, and just the poor people. And I asked them, is this art or propaganda? Because it was sponsored by the Roosevelt government in order to raise sympathy for people suffering the Great Depression, in order to create the New Deal, to create this huge shift in social policy, which is still fought over in the US, this sort of massive social programs for the poor. And I say, so is this art or propaganda? And we have a very interesting debate. And this is like benign propaganda, but still a lot of people would say that this is an artist working for the state, manipulating people for a political end they did not want to do originally. And we have a lot of debates. So what is the line? I mean, I think that ultimately the propagandist is creating closed identities. He's creating identities that are aggressive and that are closed, almost by definition, while the artist is creating empathy. But we have a real debate about it, and it's not an easy answer.
I would like to end our conversation with a question about community. The title of this year's edition of Conrad Festival is Communities. And I would like to refer to one particular community. When describing Trump supporters, you emphasized that we should not treat them as a homogeneous group, but a mix of different groups and individuals. But despite their differences, something brought them together and made them work together. This is an example of a regressive community, but a community nonetheless. What is the mechanism behind it? What made them cooperate together despite all the differences, and how strong is this bond?
Yeah, I mean, well, they're not a homogenous group. I mean, Republican voters are very, very different. And there's ones who support some bits of Trump, and all politics is about building coalitions. That's just what the job is. So they're by definition going to be coalitions, and any sensible policy would try to split them into different groups. So, but what we mean now by Trumpism in the US, as opposed to other republicanism, is really a style, I would say. It's not even a set of ideologies, it's a style. And a style which articulates a very wild sense of resentment. So it's almost a genre and a psychological motivation. And really, in many ways, what united the Trump coalition was that it was the people of all resentments, different types of resentment, cultural resentment, economic resentment, just sexual resentment. You have a resentment, I'll satisfy it, was kind of the emotional message. And also the psychological construct that Trump offered. Yeah. Biden was doing peace, coming together as an emotion. We can all come together while Trump's has always been about resentment, because he feels a lot of resentment. He's very good at channeling that. He's full of resentments. So yeah, I think that's what united all the Trump voters, is just, you could be very rich and resentful, very poor and resentful. You could be all sorts of resentful. And he gave you a way to express that resentment. And that's quite powerful. Peter,
thank you for sharing your thoughts and your time with us. I know how busy you are these days. Let me give short information to the audience. Dear all, next month I will talk to Lauren Groff, American novelist. The interview will be released on the last Thursday of July. Please remember this date. Be with us, be with Conrad Festival. Peter, once again, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.